Access to democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, the Answer Company. The division championship Minnesota Twins are looking to go all the way to the World Series in 2024. Bolstered by inspirational shortstop Carlos Correa, a healthy Brian Buxton, and rookie phenom Royce Lewis, plus a pitching staff led by Pablo Lopez and an outstanding bullpen featuring Johan Duran, the Twins are the best bargain in the major leagues, and Target Field is the best venue in baseball. Sheridan Dulas & Kins, PA, a family and criminal defense law firm, has been serving clients in Dakota County and throughout Minnesota for over 40 years. Ranked a Tier 1 Best Law Firm by U.S. News and World Report every year since 2009, Sheridan Dulas & Kins are here to help you in your most difficult life circumstances. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. Thank you for watching our program today. It's a real pleasure to welcome back to our program a good friend of ours who has been on the show previously, Dane Smith. Dane is a distinguished journalist and author and has appeared on the show numerous times. Most recently, we've had Dane on, I believe it was 2 times this past year, to talk about the subject of today's discussion. We're going to be looking back at a series that you wrote, Dane, about reappraising the good life in Minnesota. And the reappraisal relates to a famous Time magazine story from 1973. What did Time magazine say in 1973?
First of all, a little quick personal note here. I was getting out of the Navy. I was coming to Minnesota. I married into the state. So I was coming here for the first time in August of 73 to live for, make my new life. And that issue, The Good Life in Minnesota, cover of Time, which was the dominant news magazine of its time, everybody read it, was The Good Life in Minnesota. And it had Wendell Anderson on the cover. He was holding a fish. And the whole article was just this love poem to this great state about how Minnesota somehow in a time of great national malaise was functioning really well. And they attributed it to progressive liberal policies, actually. Anderson was a DFL governor, but also to community-minded Republicans and a great spirit of philanthropy among the business community. And so the subhead inside was a state that works. It was the good life. It kind of introduced the whole idea of quality of life to the nation. And subsequent, it wasn't just Time, many other media and journalists and other voices over the next decades reaffirmed this idea. We're always in the top 10 on all the things that counted.
Education,
income, wealth,
healthcare.
Right, healthcare, health conditions, educational attainment, test scores.
So this Time magazine article really caught your imagination as a young guy coming out of the Navy.
Right.
And you grew up in Texas and Alaska, right?
I was born in Texas. My heritage is all Southern. I grew up in Alaska, and I'd been all over the country in the Navy, so I kind of had a feel for the rest of the country. And over the course of my next 50 years, as both a journalist and then as a public policy researcher and analyst with Growth and Justice, which was really committed to the idea of maintaining that Minnesota exceptionalism. I discovered that what Time said in 73 was essentially true. Now, over the last few years, we've had some rocky times, as the rest of the country has, but particularly around the George Floyd protest, around the recognition that we had fallen short on racial justice in this state, that we didn't live up to our promise, around the crime spike, the whole pandemic thing. There was sort of a counter narrative against, there was anti-Time magazine, basically suggesting that Minnesota was in decline. There was some sort
We
of...
had lost our way.
We'd lost our way.
So this is what triggered you to embark on this series for MinnPost, Reappraising the Good Life. Yeah.
And I tried, I'm a journalist.
Yeah.
I do have some opinions. It was labeled commentary. But I think, just to summarize this series, it recognizes the flaws. It recognizes the facts on the table around things that we need to do better. But it also reaffirms our basic basic goodness, our basic essence we have retained that. And in fact, I brought a lot of data showing that Minnesota still ranks in the top 10, in some cases better than we did relative to other states in 1973.
But in some areas we've
In some areas we've slipped, no doubt about it.
We'll talk about that in more detail in just a moment here, but I want to read a quote that was in your series that really caught my eye. You observe that, quote, a distinctive communitarian and egalitarian spirit evolved and prevailed here in Minnesota before and since 1973, the 1973 Time article that called us a state that works. What do you see, Dane, as the roots of that, what you call communitarian or egalitarian spirit? Where did it come from?
Well, I went into considerable depth on the history of this. I give a lot of credit to our strong Native American tradition. The Ojibwe and Dakota people were obviously communitarian. I mean, it's just, that's the way they lived. They lived in harmony. Also, they were environmentalists. They lived in harmony with the environment. But then we were settled by New Englanders who, compared to others at that time in American history, were the most liberal of the states. They were abolitionists. They fought hard and died to end slavery. But they were also very public-minded. They built public institutions, schools, hospitals.
Believed in public education. First public school, Boston,
made it mandatory.
Latin school.
Exactly, made it mandatory.
Right.
And paid for it with taxes.
Right.
And that wasn't happening in the South, by the way, and in other states. So we benefited from that. And then, of course, came the big Scandinavian wave. And the Nordic countries to this day have a more communitarian way of thinking and doing. They established co-ops, farmers' co-ops, to challenge the power of capitalism and entrenched interests that often would be predatory on farmers and workers.
And some of the countries these immigrants came from, talking about Germany, Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, they have some of the highest standards of living in the world, don't they?
I like to say that, in the world, the liberal democracies following the Nordic model are similar to Minnesota, which follows kind of that Nordic model among the states. So we kind of play a parallel role in Minnesota. We are, I try not to use the word liberal throughout the series because I think it's deeper than that. It's the idea of equality, always concerned about making things more equal, more fair.
Well, it's not necessarily either equality of outcomes, it's equality of opportunities.
Right, but if
give
the equality...
people a fair chance and you'll have good results.
Right, but I'll be frank about this. If the equality of opportunity is not working, then that equality is not there. And so we do redistribute. That's what government does in a liberal democracy. It redistributes resources for economic security so that everyone has at least a dignified, decent life. And Minnesota has been more like that than most other states throughout our history.
Right. And you observed in the series some of the more recent historical precedents. Minnesota had a farmer labor party, which
Yes.
later merged under Hubert Humphrey with the
Right.
DFL, became the DFL, which still exists today. But we also, even before the farmer labor party, in the upper Midwest, you had the nonpartisan league,
Right.
you had the growth of the co-op movement. A lot of these progressive movements took hold in the upper Midwest, including Minnesota.
That's right. That's right. The Farmer Labor Party was actually much more than liberal. I think Floyd B. Olson, it's the three-term governor that was probably the national leader and was actually considered presidential material, actually said, "I'm not a liberal, I'm a radical." And the party was pushing for things that we now have.
Right. Dane, you may not know this. When I was in college, I studied under Professor Hy Berman at
Yes.
the University of Minnesota. I actually did some research, did a lot of research on Floyd B. Olson. He was a member of the IWW, the International Workers
The
of the
Wobblies.
World. As a young man, had been
Right.
working in the forests in the Pacific Northwest, and he really was radicalized out there when he saw the gaps between great wealth and people who were barely getting by. And
Right.
that became part of his politics when he became Hennepin County attorney and then governor of Minnesota at the height of the Great Depression.
Here's a little fact so Minnesota was set up to support the New Deal.
Right.
They voted overwhelmingly for FDR.
Right.
And since you see a lot of commentary in the most recent election, Minnesota stayed blue, of course, about Minnesota having the longest blue streak of the states. Hasn't voted for a Republican since '72. I looked a little deeper into that. Minnesota has also been the most Democratic voting state since 1932. We only voted for Eisenhower twice, which almost all the states did, and then Nixon and his landslide in '72.
72.
I don't know what happened there, but
Yeah, running against George McGovern,
Right.
Vietnam War and all.
Right.
Yeah.
So Minnesota is, when it sticks out like a blue thumb, election after election, and that happened again in '24. Illinois and Minnesota, the only states left in the Midwest that voted blue. That deserves analysis, and that's what Reappraising Minnesota was
about.
sort of about.
By the way, we should tell our viewers, if they want to go read the whole series, and I highly recommend that they do. I read it. It's a wonderful series, really a great analysis of our politics. You may not agree with everything you read there, your
Right.
observations, but it does get you thinking about how we've gotten to be where we are. They can read it at MinnPost, which is the online newspaper. Go to online and look for MinnPost, and you'll find the archive of your articles. So before we get too much further, I want to get into your last column that you did as part of this series, Reappraising Minnesota, what you called the 4 big problem areas. You basically identified what you call a to-do list of where you have observed you think we've fallen short or are slipping a little, and areas that you identified where you think we need to take some action. I want to go through these and get your observations quickly, keeping in mind our time limitations.
And these just aren't my ideas. This is
Other people
this is a
too,
bipartisan consensus on these, I think.
Social justice and climate action.
Right. Well, here we're hearing, because of the white backlash that always comes after big leaps forward in racial justice, which followed George Floyd, and in an effort at reconciliation and understanding what was happening here. DEI is a dirty word.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right. All the efforts that we've made to try and equalize racial opportunity are under attack now. And so in this segment of that last article, I'm making the case that we have to stay the course on that. Racial justice should remain a top imperative. Almost 25% of our people are of color.
I was stunned by that, by the way. When the 1973 Time article came out, it said,
2%.
I believe, 2%. And we've gone from 2% 50 years
Right.
ago to about a quarter
Right.
of our population are now
Right.
people of color.
We are of color, and we have to take care of we have to take care of these. We have to address these disparities. So this is at the outset, I make an argument about staying the course and not turning away from racial justice. And similarly with climate change. The current president-elect is saying that, or maybe well, he might as well be president, is saying that climate change is a hoax that is just flat out false, and I think Minnesota will stay the course on reducing the carbon emissions that are.
Can we be encouraged that
burning the
Minnesota
earth up.
voters last fall, they actually approved a constitutional amendment, an extension of an environmental trust fund that dedicates money
Yes.
toward protecting the environment?
No, almost no other state has done something like this.
To preserve our parks, our lakes, our wetlands. That's what we're famous for, our lakes.
Right, raised its own taxes for environmental protection.
That's
Nobody
remarkable.
does that. And I do think that, so one of the 5 recommendations I made, or 2 of the 5 were, stay the course on racial justice, adjust to reality, to what the criticisms have been of whatever we're doing with DEI training and so forth, take into account some common sense changes that we might make, but stay that course. And similarly on climate action.
Education, you talk about education redesign. We are seeing declining enrollment in some of our urban public schools in the Minneapolis system, St. Paul. They're running budget shortfalls. We're also seeing something more recently where a number of school districts, not just in the cities, but in urban and suburban areas too, or suburban areas as well, where voters have done something recently that's almost unheard of in Minnesota, where there have been referenda to increase fundings for schools to keep up with technology and such, and infrastructure, the school buildings themselves, where voters have rejected some of those.
Right.
It's still a minority, but that's
Right.
something you almost never heard about in Minnesota. Do you see support for public education in Minnesota slipping in some places?
I don't think the evidence is strong enough to suggest that people are willing to abandon the idea entirely and go to a voucher system or whatever. In most communities, especially in greater Minnesota, there is no other option other than the public school. And its support for public schools, I think, remains strong. You know, as the baby boomers age, they don't have kids in school. The percentage of the population with kids in school has really declined in this. That explains part of it. And so I think, you know, in the section that I wrote about what we need to do in addressing public schools, I concentrate on test scores, on results, lagging. A lot of that was due to the pandemic, but it was, and it had was gradually getting better actually until the pandemic. But I'm concerned about the fact that on many of these rankings that various organizations do, Minnesota is kind of dropping out of the top 10 on educational quality. On some areas, we're still very high ACT scores.
Right. But on reading and math school scores, basic achievement tests in schools, we see some slippage, particularly among minority students.
Yes, and that again is part of the racial justice imperative.
Is it just a matter?
But I don't have all the answers here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people thinking about and working on this. I'm just saying we have to elevate it as a priority.
Right. Do you see it, Dane, as just a matter of how much we spend on these problems, or it's more complex than that? It's certainly, when you talk about something like supporting public education, no question, money is important.
Right.
But are there other factors too that have to be weighed into that calculation of how we do better?
Certainly. You know, money and good intentions are not enough. We've got to find ways to really concentrate on outcomes. However, this idea that money doesn't matter is ridiculous. You know, wealthy people who put their kids into the exclusive private schools are spending $30,000 to $40,000 a year. So, you know, I think the per pupil expenditure in Minnesota right now might be somewhere between 10 and 15. They're spending twice as much. Obviously, money makes a difference to them.
I doubt that a single mom in South Minneapolis has $30,000 or $40,000 to spend on private school tuition.
Exactly, and wealthy parents just lavish, just throw money at their kids' preschool, tutoring, travel, enrichment, you name it. And if we provide that for everybody, that's going to cost money.
The late Senator Paul Wellstone, one of his famous expressions was, when we all do better, we all do better.
Right.
And I think that's sort of getting at that same idea.
That statement is central to this entire project.
And he was, again, during his career in public office, he was a strong proponent of trying to reduce these disparities in achievement and inputs that we put into public education and things.
Right. Well, that lies at the heart of Minnesota's essence, this idea of common good, that if we lift the fortunes, if we invest in human potential, that will serve everybody's interests. Because even, if you're always catering to the richest people's and the businessman's immediate needs for quarterly profits, and you neglect human capital, you will pay the price. Business is best served with an educated workforce, with a workforce that is healthy, wealthy, and wise. And unless they're willing to pay for all that it takes to achieve that and pay higher wages, we as a community, the government, need to make the investments to make sure that happens.
And you've suggested, too, that we should really be taking seriously a move toward making higher education and vocational technical education free, basically.
Right. Well, certainly much more affordable.
How can we go about that?
Well, we've already made some steps on it, taken some big steps in that direction. This 23 legislative session made education essentially free for people below a certain income level at the state colleges and universities. I'm a product of Inver Hills Community College.
Right.
I know how important that was. I paid almost nothing for it. It was free when I was going to school in 1973, essentially. And so I think we should follow, again, the Nordic model and other liberal democracies where you can go as far as your talent and your aptitude takes you, and your willingness to do the work in higher education. We ought to make that free. And there's some places where they actually pay people to get credentials and higher ed credentials, either in the trades, something beyond high school.
And to be fair to businesses, too, there are a number of businesses that have programs that support their employees getting more education to improve their skill set.
Right, they understand the value of that.
Something else we should say about the business community in Minnesota, you mentioned earlier the contributions of businesses here to philanthropy, but we should really underscore the point, we are not a megastate. We're about, 6 million people now in Minnesota, approximately.
Yeah, we're,
and yet we're
21st in population.
Yeah, we are sort of in the middle, and yet we're home to a disproportionate number of Fortune 500 companies that have made Minnesota home, from healthcare to various other high-tech businesses, research, the Mayo Clinic. Our healthcare sector is perhaps one of our most famous, but there are other emerging industries here too. We've long been a leader in agriculture. Those companies stay in Minnesota. Isn't part of the reason that they know they have access to this well-educated workforce?
Absolutely. That is, when you ask in business surveys, why Minnesota has such a large concentration of corporations here, that's what they always respond with, that the workforce is good, that the workforce is, and that Minnesota is basically good for business. And so, this is interesting. Two of those biggest corporations in Minnesota, by the way, started out as co-ops. One of them is Land O'Lakes and the other is CHS right here in Dakota County.
Right. Very interesting. And then a fourth area that you identified on the to-do list, talking about crime and public safety. Certainly this becomes an issue of intense importance to people living in our communities. They want to be safe. But not just in suburban or rural areas, people in inner city areas want to be safe too.
Sure.
Say a word about that, your observations about how can we improve public safety?
Right. A few things kind of diminish faith in government and in progressive policy more than high crime rates. There's sort of a feeling that, this efforts to provide racial justice by not having a huge percentage of people of color in prison is undercut when you have a crime rate in an urban area, and many of the suspects and perpetrators are in fact people of color. I will say that I think conservatives and demagogues have there's no excuse for how they've politicized it and the way they portray it.
But in a lot of cases, haven't they exaggerated? In fact, FBI statistics on the most serious crimes show significant drops in the past couple of years for the most serious crimes, for homicides, assaults. Even in Minnesota, we had a rash of carjackings here in the Twin Cities Metro. Those numbers are way down.
Right, and we had a U.S. attorney appointed by Joe Biden who went after it with a vengeance. Andy Lugar was
going to be leaving now.
Yeah, he really cracked down on that and got and addressed it admirably. He really did almost cut the carjackings down to pre-pandemic levels. But it's still a problem, and I still think we may have erred too far on the side of leniency, especially. It's not so much leniency, it's the fact that for juveniles, they no longer even have a place to go, even a humane place to go. And so they're just often released back into the streets and they reoffend. Getting rid of some of these juvenile detention facilities was a mistake. I think there's a consensus there. So there's that and a number of things that we can do to bring some common sense solutions to crime, because you can always say that crime is too high. And you can play with the statistics forever, but the perception that it's a problem is, I think, based in reality, and we got to keep after it.
People need, as you observed in one of your articles, they need to feel safe getting on the light rail, to go downtown, to go to a Twins game or go shopping. And if you don't feel safe, that's a problem that government has to address.
Right. I don't understand to this day why they can't just put a security officer on every train in the system. But
And very interesting. You wrote an op-ed for the Star Tribune that I believe it was in August this past year, and it was after the Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris had picked our own governor Tim Walz as her running mate. And you, in the article, it was interesting. You sort of looked at Tim Walz and some of the things he was proposing and saying, here's an example of these kind of communitarian and egalitarian values that we're talking about. And Tim Walz, like you, was not a native Minnesotan. He grew up in Nebraska and came to Minnesota as a teacher in Mankato. Say a word about that op-ed that you wrote.
People who move here are often more enthusiastic Minnesota boosters than people
us native
who've always lived here. What I did with that piece is I noticed that there was a flurry of news reports, and it's just a media frenzy over Walz, and a lot of it was superficial. You know, it was like he had a dadly vibe, and he was just a neighborly guy, and you know, it was Coach Walz, exactly. And what I was saying is that I wish that the media would take a deeper look at Minnesota and the exceptionalism here. You know, how we're different.
And you saw him as part of trying to preserve that too.
And it was a way to get people into the themes of my Reappraising Minnesota series too. So it served a dual purpose. Walz, of course, and the Harris-Walz ticket did lose, but I haven't seen anybody pick up on this. I did an analysis of what happens, what the margin is in Minnesota when Republicans win nationally. It's usually 2 percentage points. Walz and Harris won by 4 in Minnesota.
Dane Smith, author and journalist, author of the series in MinnPost, Reappraising Minnesota, a state that works. Thank you for being our guest, talking about your series. Thank you for coming to Access to Democracy, and we hope to have you on again.
Always a pleasure, Steve.
Thank you.